get by. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I feel like 100 grand.
You are listening to Inspired Insider with your host, Dr. Jeremy Weisz.
Dr. Jeremy Weisz here, founder of InspiredInsider.com, where I talk with inspirational entrepreneurs and leaders. Today is no different. I have Nithya Ramachandran, the T1 Agency. You can check them out at t1agency.com. Nithya, before I formally introduce you, I always like to point out other episodes of the podcast people should check out. Since this is part of the Top Agency series, some other interesting episodes to check out. A fan favorite for people was Todd Taskey. Todd Taskey helps pair agencies with private equity, helps sell agencies. So it was interesting conversation around M&A, around the valuation space, around the agency space. He has a Second Bite podcast. It's called The Second Bite because he finds sometimes when founders sell to private equity and then private equity sells again, sometimes they make more on the second bite than they do on the first. Another really good one was Adit Clevitt. Adit Clevitt is a company, agency that helps process documentation. She helps to document SOPs for companies. She's a done-for-you solution for that. So it was interesting because we talked about how do you smooth out the onboarding of clients? How do you smooth out the onboarding of staff? And we geeked out on our favorite software and tools on that episode. So check that out more on InspiredInsider.com. This episode is brought to you by Rise 25. Rise 25, we help businesses give to and connect to their dream relationships and partnerships. How do we do that? We do that by helping you run your podcast. We're an easy button for a company to launch and run a podcast. We do the strategy, the accountability, and the full execution of the podcast. And Nithya, we call ourselves the magic elves that run in the background to make it look easy for the host, saying create amazing content, create amazing relationships, most importantly, run their business. For me, the number one thing in my life is relationships. I'm always looking at ways to give to my best relationships, and I found no better way over the past decade to profile the people and companies I most admire and share with the world what they're working on. So if you've thought about podcasting, you should. If you have questions, go to rise25.com or email us at support@rise25.com. We actually have a lot of free resources on the podcast on any question you may possibly have on podcasting. So check those out. I'm excited to introduce today's guest. We have Nithya Ramachandran. She is president and CSO at T1 Agency. T1 helps amplify impactful brands, and they've been at the game for 30 years. Actually. And she helps brands rise above the noise by placing their audience at the heart of every decision. And, we're going to talk about some of the bold strategies that she helps implement for the company and for other companies they work with. So, Nithya, thanks for joining me.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
Just start us off and tell people about the T1 Agency and what you do. As you do that, I'll pull up your site.
Yeah, sounds amazing. Thank you. The T1 Agency, as Jeremy mentioned, we've been around for 30 years and we've been independent for those 30 years. We're a Black founded agency. Our founder's name is Mark Harrison. And what we like to say is that we're an experiences agency. So what we really focus on is how do we unite brands with people? How do we do that authentically? How do we do that in a value-driven way that truly is based on connection, that's based on meaning? Because what we really believe in is how do we ignite these communities? How do we build these experiences between brands and through people so that they're meaningful, that they're unforgettable, even in those in the toughest of challenges. So that's really what we focus on. We have a huge legacy in sponsorship, in partnerships. For those 30 years, we have this legacy in activation, experiential marketing, as well as in sports marketing as well. So that's really some of the elements that's part of our DNA. We also do a lot of research in the sponsorship landscape as well, with an annual sponsorship landscape study that's been going for, this year will be the 19th year, going strong. So it's something we're super passionate about. And for us, like I said, if it's about connection, if it's about people, that's what really it comes down to. Yes, of course, we have brands as clients, but we see the people behind the brand, the people behind the logos really first, and that's what we focus on.
We're looking at, if you're looking with me on the website
Mhm.
at the T1 agency, we're looking at things. Mondelez is a huge company. If people haven't heard
Yeah.
of it, they've heard of the brands, right? But we're looking at Cadbury, Oreo, Ritz, Chips Ahoy, Sour Patch Kids. I've done interviews at the Sweets and Snack Show, and like Mondelez dominates the Sweets and Snack Show as far as the
Yeah.
stuff. I'm like, I didn't realize that was the main umbrella company until I went to the Sweets and Snack Show, and they like own everything.
The best part is when they're your client and then you suddenly get magical boxes of treats at the
Ex-
office. And so we have these big bins of like Crispers and Oreo and chips. It's great. It's dangerous, but it's fantastic.
I do want to dig in. Well, we will talk about community building and partnerships and things
Mhm.
like that and what you do. But I do want to hear your journey at the T1 agency is really interesting. And talk about your journey with the company because now you run the
Yeah.
company. But where did you start?
Yeah, I started not in the marketing space. So if we go all the way back to like the university days, I got my degree in international business. I think I took two marketing classes, like the marketing prerequisite class you have to take in business school, and like an international marketing class. That's it. And so then after university, I decided to put my international business degree to use and went and lived in Madrid, Spain for a year, went and lived in Hyderabad, India for a few months, went and lived in London, England for a year and a half, and somehow kind of fell into this marketing and communication space, which, really started with my roles in India. It started with, my role in London as well, which was at PwC. So clearly they saw some good transferable skills that moved over there. And then, all the visas ran out, had to move back to Canada, got to transfer with PwC in Canada. And when I felt like I wanted to move on there, literally met somebody drunk at a wedding. She was like, "Hey, do you want to come work at an agency?" My question is, what's an agency? We went for lunch. She told me about Edelman, which about a decade ago is how I moved into the agency space, which was super interesting because at that time, Edelman
Are
was
they one of the
going
biggest agencies or the biggest agency at this
they're
point? Or
the largest independent family-run agency in the world. Yeah. And at the time when I joined is when they were going, and the PR industry writ large was going through an evolution of how do we broaden our service offering to not just be the earned media experts, but really the communications partners and experts at the table. So yeah, got to work on some really compelling, interesting work there, including leading, for example, the Shell account across Canada and growing that business in a very multifaceted way. And then I was living in Calgary at the time, big oil and gas town. Felt like I wanted to broaden or spread my marketing wings a little bit. So made the transition over to Toronto, moved to a different PR shop here in Toronto. But that's where I really got to transition from the account side into strategy. So I was working strategy at National Public Relations, where I got to work in, of course, planning, communications planning, got to do some business strategy as well, and also some branding work as well, which was really fantastic. And then during, height of pandemic or right after, when everybody was questioning their lives and what they wanted to do next, I was really looking for an opportunity that was, working with an organization that was quite purpose driven, that was quite values driven, that was, really around, walking the talk. And so that's when I had come across Mark Harrison, his partner Karen Stern. We had some really great conversations. At the time, T1 as the founder of, um, sorry, Mark Harrison as the founder of T1, and in the wake of COVID, had also started two nonprofits. So when we're talking about walk the talk, he, for example, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, had started the Black Talent Initiative to really build equity for Black talent in Canada. But also, he had started and co-founded a nonprofit called Park Street Education, which really looked at how do we provide and deliver quality education for underestimated audiences in Canada, especially in a virtual setting. So, when I really looked at what were those proof points of walking the talk, that's when I came and joined this group here. Initially, when I started within this group, it was actually working not on T1, but on on the nonprofits, on some of the other ventures within, our siblings, as it were, because we started these ventures. How do we accelerate the growth? So really got to dig in and think about the brand, about the marketing, about the positioning. How does this really break through, especially in such an uncertain time? And then there was an opportunity to come in as general manager of T1 and really look at the day-to-day operations of the organization, which won't lie, hard. That was 2022 in Canada. We were still in lockdowns for Q1 and part of Q2 of 2022. So, we were really, really feeling that pinch with, as being a big experiential marketing agency too, that pinch was really there. And then we had an opportunity, in a conversation with Mark, who is still very involved with T1, with all of our other ventures as well, but wanted to take a step back from the day to day of T1 and focus on a lot of his other ventures, the sponsorship pact with our nonprofits as well. And so really this opportunity to come in and lead the organization came from a conversation, came from the relationship that Mark and I had built. And, when talking about walking the talk, it really comes down to that. It's not about, weird policies. It's not about process. It's really around people. It's about relationships. It's around that value and that purpose that's there, and wanting to build up and rise up, people that are from underestimated audiences in our communities. And so that's what I would say. Long story short, short
It's
story
a
long,
pretty
whichever way.
cool journey. I'm going to dig into a couple pieces
Yeah.
there, but I do want to talk about, if there's a lot of maybe marks out there, visionary founders, and they want a Nithya, right?
Yeah.
They want someone to help and, run things so they can maybe focus on the vision, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so I'd love to hear what worked with the transition from you
Mm.
taking over, and then maybe some things that you would go back and you're like, you know what, we would maybe have done this a little bit differently with the
Mm.
transition from you taking over.
Yeah, great question. So, in and around COVID, the organization had implemented EOS, Entrepreneurial Operating System.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
sure you've chatted to.
I've had Gino Wickman on the podcast. Yep.
Yeah, good old Gino. Like, so when anybody onboards, we give everybody his book. What the heck is EOS? So I think that was one of the big unlocks that we had organizationally of being able to delineate between visionary founder and integrator. And I think when we were able to delineate those two roles, which most organizations aren't able to do, right, based on personality, based on talent, based on the way brains work, I think that unlocked a lot for us in terms of organizational efficiency as well. And so we started really implementing before I started with the group, but around, in and around COVID time for all of our organizations and in the collective. And so for me, I think the transition of going from that integrator role as externally facing, we called it, of course, general manager, but going from that operational role, then moving into the visionary role helped with the transition feel a little bit more natural because we were able to draw some of those lines in the sand. The other piece of it is with that transition, it also timed up with our current general manager, Liz Rose, who had just come back from her parental leave as well from her with her son. And so for us, I think one of the big keys and learnings is timing. We didn't have a lot of mess because we had all of us shift roles at the exact same time, which helped with, not just drawing lines in the sand, but shifting those lines person to person. So I think that was a big, and that you can't time that all the time necessarily, but for us, I think timing and having right people in the right seat, which is also another EOS principle, was really, really beneficial for us with that transition. I think for us, we also made sure that we really thought about what those expectations were of each one of those roles, not even necessarily like job descriptions, but really just making sure we were saying what we mean and meaning what we say, a phrase my cousin loves to say, but really making sure that we weren't having to read between the lines, but being very open and vocal in that communication. And then another EOS principle, which is top to top, which we, the three of us, as founder, as visionary, as integrator, founder, as president, as general manager, have a lot of frequent collaboration so that we can make sure that we're still steering the ship in the right way. We're kind of learning from each other. So there are all these elements of circular mentorship that are really there as well. And even though some might see that as a hierarchy, I would say like we meet weekly or bi-weekly. I think there's a lot of learning that can happen when we see each other as peers, when we acknowledge the diversity of experience all of us have had as well. So I would say if things that made us really successful were, if I could summarize it, were timing was really helpful. I think expectation setting was really helpful. That's all at the upfront, but I think then the ways of working, we've taken a very collaborative approach going forward that has made us successful in those roles as well. And sometimes where we can dip our toe into that swim lane and back when we need to help try and solve problems.
What would you have done differently in the process?
I think one of the challenges is, and I don't know how I would have done this differently, but I think one of the challenges is like, when you see your former boss, when you see somebody who's your mentor kind of giving you the keys but still being in the day to day, I think sometimes, not to his fault, but from my own space, find your voice in those situations. And I know I'm a very loud, extroverted person, but I think sometimes you question of like, can I say that because he's been running this organization for at that time 28 years, right? Like, is that a valid thought? Is that not? So I think some of that self-doubt, some of that like fear, which is very natural, by the way, in these roles, I think it's maybe being able to I wish, and maybe if I could go back and give myself that advice, it's finding the right tools or finding the right forums to still figure out how I can articulate those thoughts instead of just taking what is said as maybe the marching orders or taking what is said as what to do next versus truly approaching it as a collaboration and a conversation. Because I think it's, as much as the world puts these thing isms on us, whether that's ageism, racism, sexism, whatever the thing, I think, obviously and instinctually we internalize some of those elements. So I think if I could go back, I would think about what are some of those tools, what are some of those triggers that I could use to combat that internally, even so that I was still, giving, voice to power, like voice to some of those thoughts instead of just taking everything as gospel, as it were. So I think a lot of it is for me internally of rising into that role.
I think, that's a really interesting point, and I'm glad you said it because I
Mm,
think it applies across any position, honestly. And when you
yeah.
say that, no matter where someone's at in an organization, there's always going to be someone that maybe is a little more experienced, maybe there's been there longer, and they question, do I bring this up? Do I share? And
Mhm.
like it depends on the culture. We'll talk a little about culture, but
Yeah.
if someone's free to just share and um, be, kind of step into leadership, no matter where they're at in the organization, it's helpful, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes the culture is not there where that stuff gets shut down, and they're not gonna feel free to say those things.
Yeah, one of the terms that I use a lot is courage. I think there's a big difference between courage and bravery, right? Like bravery is acting without fear. Courage is acting in spite of that fear. And I think all of us, to your point, in any situation, have self-doubt, have, a thought, a nag in the back of our mind of like, is that right? Is that not? And again, those are all healthy things that we should have because that make sure that we're being empathetic, that make sure that we're actually thinking through decisions. We're not just acting on instinct, but it's then having the courage to act despite some of those fears that you might have, or don't let those things hold you back. It's what's the action you can still take in spite of that.
Yeah, and I want to go back to your
Mm,
Edelman days for a second because it's really
yeah.
interesting, probably working at a huge agency and then working at smaller agencies.
Mhm.
So I'd love to hear some of the lessons you learned that you bring into, the T1 agency. Before you answer that, I do want to touch on Rock, you mentioned the Integrator Visionary. There's a really good book. So Mark Winters was also on the podcast, so people can check that out. He wrote Rocket Fuel with Gino Wickman,
Mhm.
and they talk a lot about the
Yeah.
visionary integrator. And for me, when I listened to it, it was eye-opening because I'd never really thought of that delineation, before.
Mhm.
So I encourage people to check that out from what Nithya was saying. Edelman.
Definitely something
Yeah.
I read before taking on that general manager role.
Yeah, I found it super helpful. Edelman, what were some of the
Yeah.
lessons you learned there that you bring into, from a huge
Great
agency?
question. Yeah, and Edelman, my experience there was super fascinating because even though it's the, world's largest independent, family-run agency in the world, offices all around the world, hundreds of people, the office that I worked in Calgary was like 16 people. So it was like we were a small office in this giant network. But something that Edelman does really well is culturally. So even though we had offices across Canada, offices around the world, there definitely was this element of, and it's very cutesy. They put Edel in front of everything, Edel people, Edel culture, Edel, so part of that is, culture. There was this culture of excellence, culture of like process and making sure that change management was happening across the board. So I think when I think about some of the lessons that I learned in that space moving forward, a lot of it comes down to like rigor, like a lot of process rigor, compliance rigor, data rigor that I saw even at like PwC being a giant global accounting and consultancy firm. I saw similarities that with at Edelman. So bringing that kind of forward was really important. I think these how do you live your values in terms of excellence and quality? A lot of those people really helped. I brought that forward as well. And I think Edelman does do a really great job of helping folks incubate and experiment and innovate in places. And not all agencies will let you do that, right? Like a lot of agencies will be like, this is our playbook, this is the way that we work, you have to follow it. But I did find that there was really nice runway there for you to play and experiment and build and grow and shape. And so that was something that made me realize that, as somebody that's an entrepreneur, not an entrepreneur, but has some of those qualities and tendencies of somebody of an entrepreneur inside of an organization, I felt like that was one of the first times I could really unlock that. And it's kind of stayed with me career wise of being able to challenge status quo, maybe about experimenting, about innovating, about playing, about creating, all in service of quality of excellence and in the agency world in service of course, client objectives as well.
No, that's super interesting. And I think if you look at companies, I bet entrepreneurs play a huge role in moving those companies forward. And I'd love to hear, how did Edelman foster that incubation? You always hear with Google that they
Mm.
have 25% time they can work on other projects, and like that's how Gmail was created, and there's all these other things. How did Edelman kind of foster that incubation or entrepreneur spirit?
Yeah, I think it came down to culture. Like, I don't think it wasn't around like specific initiatives necessarily. I think it was around culture. I think it was around thinking about problem solving versus like, even though and it's interesting in the PR space because you actually rarely get a brief from a client. It's usually a call and like, oh God, we need a thing. So it's also being able to problem solve. It's being able to like read between the lines. And I think a lot of that innovation is around that, right? Just because you don't have four walls and an incubator or a lab or something like that, doesn't mean that you don't necessarily you can't flex some of those skills. And when we really think about innovation and thinking about outside the box, it's being able to look at problems differently and be able to solve them. So I think a lot of it came down to the culture and the people that worked there.
That makes sense. I want to go. We were talking before we hit record, about maternity leave. And I'd love to
Hmm.
know, what did you do to prepare? Because, like you were saying, you could be gone for 10 months. What
Hmm.
did you do to prepare the team and the company before you're on
Yeah.
your motherhood journey, I guess you could say?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, for context for the non-Canadian listeners, in Canada, you can actually take up to 18 months parental leave. That's covered in part in some way by the government of Canada. Most people in Canada tend to take about 12 months, and there is a big shift happening to because you can also split the 18 months amongst two parents. So there is a big wave of, one parent taking 12, one parent taking 6, for example, at the other end of it. I ended up taking roughly 10 months or so. So it is a substantial absence from your role, from your organization. There is business continuity planning that does need to happen. The benefit within agency a lot of time is okay, cool, you get staffed on client projects that are project based, and you just hand off the project and go. There's some benefit there when it comes to parental leave, but in my role, it's slightly different. So for me, a lot of the preparation came down to um, it was around people and it was around setting them up for success. So I went on parental leave, I think around like November 30th of 23. So for me, the big focus of that October, November was making sure that my role ended up being split up, I think around 5 or 6 people. We didn't just do a direct replacement hire, which is also very common to do, like a parental leave cover. So we split up my role into different fractions. So it did become and add on to certain people's roles. That was one part of it. The second part was really outlining what the responsibilities of different parts of those roles were. So by taking my various responsibilities and bucketing them out, as it were. And then the third bucket of that was making sure they were set up for success, right? So these were the documents, the tools that you need. These were the lessons learned. This is the ideas for how you can run this in the next X amount of months. And you know what I would say the fourth one is trust, right? You just have to set up folks for success and have the trust and the confidence that the work that you've been able to do to date, they will be able to continue and go forward and trust their best judgment to take that forward. And so for me, I completely disconnected. I was like, all right, go forth and conquer, kind of shift it off and let them do their thing. And there are a lot of parents when they're on leave stay connected, still check emails, things like that. That's their choice. For me, I really kind of disengaged and took that opportunity to heal, to spend quality time with my family. And so when I came back, which I feel like might be your follow-up question, when I came back into the role, I really spent the first almost 3 weeks, 4 weeks, just listening, just understanding. So I did a bit of a listening tour with a lot of folks, to understand what went well, what didn't go well, what their ideas for improvement were. Went back to some of those documents and we're like, okay, so what happened? What were the iterations? What were the insights? What were the learnings? So that we could set up the next year really well. One of the nice things about coming back at the end of the fiscal is that I could almost use that as an excuse to listen, learn, and then apply to the next year's planning. So there was, again, timing played a lot in my favor upon return as well. Sorry, I probably stole your question.
No, I was gonna go back to what we'll talk about after you got back, but I'm curious, you split these things up with 5 different people.
Mhm,
What would be an example of something? It could be an example of
mhm.
something that was hard for you to like, oh my God, I'm not like this is my zone of genius. I don't know if anyone can do this. What was one example where here's something that we gave to one of the team members to execute on or to be, responsible for?
So with my role, so I play a dual role of president, but also chief strategy officer. So I also run our strategy and creative team. So with that one, it actually did involve a hire of a fractional VP of strategy. Nat Tubanos is brilliant. So being able to bring her in, but honestly, with that one, I felt really bad because our overlap was only 5 days. So I felt like I was rushing through a bunch of stuff and like maybe not setting her up for success upon reflection. I'm just like, oh my God, here's a bunch of stuff, go forth and conquer, but without the benefit of time on that side. But that's an example of one of the big pieces. So literally the department, like the strategy department of the agency is one of those elements that, yeah, I had to hand over.
Strategy, I feel like, is a difficult thing in general to hand over. What did you do? Did you just like download your brain into videos? Like, how did you actually,
Yeah,
in a very short period of time, at least
yeah.
do the best you could to get someone up to speed?
Yeah, so the brilliance of
Because
Nat
that's
is
like
that
your
she's
decades of knowledge
yeah.
distilled down.
The key is hire people smarter than you. So I hired Nat, who was smarter than me and had decades or more in different types of agencies in a similar type of strategy role. So our kind of transition and training was just really around how our agency did things. So it was more focused on templates, process, tools, but our transition was actually here's a bunch of stuff I would like actually for you to break and make better. Here's some like iterative drafts of things, but this is how you can take and make better with your brilliance. So for me, it was more important to hire somebody smarter. Because I will not, hate being the smartest person in the room. I don't want to be the smartest person in the room. And so yeah, being able to collaborate with her before and now since I've been back has been super refreshing and eye-opening. And I've been able to learn, which I really love.
So when you got back, I'm curious how
Mhm.
your role changed. In my mind, I'm thinking,
Mm,
okay, I'm going to come back. They don't need me. I've handed off.
mm,
They've been doing all this stuff for 10 months. They don't need me for these things,
yeah.
right? So, which is a good thing. And
Mhm.
then and I'd be thinking, okay, where do I fit in now?
Yeah.
So how did your role change when you came back?
Yeah. Great question. I would say, so I've been back now almost exactly 3 months. I wouldn't say the timing is this, but there's definitely has been 3 phases.
You can just
Okay.
kick your legs up on the desk now. Like I'm relaxed. I had
Exactly.
it.
Just get
No.
a paycheck and go home. I mean, stay at home. Yeah. So I'd say phase one was what I mentioned before, that kind of wading in the water, listening, chatting with people, getting a sense of what's changed, what hasn't changed, what's iterated, what we could do going forward. So that was really phase one. It was exciting, catching up with folks, etc. I think, and maybe this follows that kind of storming, norming, forming methodology too. The second phase of this was actually a lot of frustration. And why I say that is because, as you rightly point out, of course, over 10 months, the organization had to build systems and processes to survive without me. Of course, that is exactly what needs to happen. So those systems and processes keep going, but I had to figure out which systems and processes do I need to pause, break, hit reset on. But the problem is I didn't realize that. So it was just a lot of frustration, to be really honest, of like, what's happening? Why are we like it felt like there were two people, I was stepping on toes, there were multiple people doing multiple things. So when I had that realization, with in conversation with a really great friend of mine who had also come back from maternity leave last year, she went through a very similar thing, and she's the one that pointed out this idea of like they had to build systems without you. So what needs to change, pivot, stop, reset, break going forward? And when I had that aha moment, that unlocked a lot of things for me. So that was helped me have conversations in service of what needs to shift, what needs to change, what do I need to come back in, what needs to stay, because it actually worked better as status quo. And then I think now we're in this third phase of like coming along, chugging along. Things are now working well because we were able to have that realization. But I think a lot of times we don't talk about reintegration of parents when they come into the workforce. Some organizations might do like some onboarding, some organizations have like buddies. But I would say something to really think about is one, like, you actually need to re-onboard some of your people. Like if they haven't been at work for 12 to 18 months, they probably forgot the file naming system. You know what I mean? Like the ways of working within an organization, you need to re-onboard them. And then I would say for anybody that's the leader or the manager of somebody on parental leave, it's coming back very specifically to your question of like, what's their role? What's changed and what hasn't? Because you can't just come back and assume everything's the same. It's actually a really common philosophy with expats when they move to a different country and then come back. Reintegration is harder sometimes than moving to a new country. Because when you move to a new country, you go in with the mindset, new language, new food, new customs, new ways of working, right? But when you come back to your country, there's this almost unconscious thing of like, wait, why isn't this exactly the same as I left it? Things that my friends have moved on, things have happened. It's a very similar experience for parents reintegrating in, especially of months of being not there or prioritizing a different part of their life.
It's a very interesting stress test for a
Mhm.
business to experience that because, and I'm sure stuff when you come back, things are functioning better. And
Yeah,
there's things like you said, wait, why are we doing that? And you need to change it or break it. So yeah, thanks for sharing those
yeah,
phases. I do want to talk about community building and
yeah,
what you do as a company. And you could let me know if we should start with Mondelez or we should start with, there was a large sports
yeah.
organization I know you worked with.
Hmm. Yeah, so for us, when we were really thinking about what we excel in, and of course, every company hopefully is thinking about their unique sales proposition, their value proposition to clients. For us, we realized it was really around community. It's about building community, it's around igniting community, it's around moving community, right? Those proof points being in the communities we've helped build with, Black Talent Initiative, with the sponsorship industry, with our platform called Sponsorship X. But what we also realized is, as the world has gotten more and more fragmented, as algorithms and the internet have created more niche audiences and communities, that's where people are finding belonging, right? Inherently, they find it in community, and that community is based on location, based on interest, based on whatever the different pieces are, right? So, for us as an agency, it's really thinking about how do we make brands and clients relevant in those communities, and how do we create movement and momentum within those communities so that there is those relevant connection points to our client as well. So, we had a really interesting problem to solve with, a large national sports or international sports organization where, they're not necessarily building women-based teams at this organization, but they wanted to think about how do we integrate women fans, right? How do we mobilize and activate women fans into the sport, right? And so those are the types of questions we like to try and solve, because when we think about community, it really is culture, right? Like, I always love to say, like, I am not the sports person. When somebody starts talking about sports at work, I say hashtag sports. But the thing I love about sports is fan culture. There's an obsession about it, right? There's such a passion that follows it. And as a very proud bandwagon sport fan, I love getting wrapped up into that as well. So that's a really interesting problem that we're working through and solving through, is how do you engage more women in this specific sport and in this specific culture, right? And it's all around how do you find common ground? How do you find those inroads? How do you activate with the right partners to find that relevance, right? So that, it could be something that becomes part of their day to day, part of their routine, part of their interests and their hobbies, where they can find new community as well. So that's kind of where our ethos lies as an agency, and that was just a really interesting problem that we're solving and working through right now. But it's a lens that we try and take with all of our clients.
What are some mistakes people make when they're trying to build community? Because obviously organizations
Mm,
come to you, they've maybe been trying a variety of things over the years. What are the
yeah.
mistakes you see companies making with building community?
Not understanding the community. So I think a lot of it is they try and slap it together, right? They just say, well, we have a campaign. It's the power dynamic, to be really frank, right? We're the brand, we're the company, we have this campaign, we have this thing to offer. Here, there's this community, just go do it. And they try and slam it together. But that's literally like a car hitting a wall, right? Because it's not thinking about what are the needs, the wants, the values, the behaviors of this community, and what are we trying to affect, and what are we trying to change. So it's really around how do you find those integration points so that you can mesh, that you can connect meaningfully together. And it's without that insight, without that understanding, that's when it comes up flat, right? It comes up like, why is that thing here? Why are these people here, right? Like, really easily, it's like, say you're at like a music festival, right? Or a food festival. It's a very easy example. All of us have been to one, right? So the city's put something on, there's a music festival, food festival, say it's a jazz fest. And you have a brand that just comes in and, I don't know, they're like selling paintballs, and you're like, why are they here? Like, this has nothing to do with the jazz fest. Now, maybe if it was like an EDM fest and they were throwing the paint in the air because that's part of EDM culture, that makes a lot more sense, right? So it's really just making sure that there's relevancy. That's how you can really make it authentic.
And then with Mondelez, what did you do
Mhm.
with them?
Yeah, so we did this really cool campaign called Snack to the Beat with Mondelez. So this is with a couple of the brands, including, Sour Patch Kids and Chips Ahoy. A lot of, and it's well-known knowledge, mental health crisis is an all-time high, but youth mental health is particularly an issue at an all-time high. So Mondelez really wanted to do something that galvanized the Gen Z audience, instead of just like, here's some Sour Patch Kids, but being something a little bit more relevant, right? I mean, Sour Patch Kids might solve some problems, but not all. So, we partnered with CAMH, which is one of the Canadian foundations that focuses on mental health. We also partnered with Johnny Orlando, who's a big musician, and really tried to build this campaign and this platform where the Gen Z audience could feel connected with not just the brand, but the topic at large. So again, it wasn't just hey, Sour Patch Kids chips were like sponsoring this thing. It was how do we create these integration points where, Johnny Orlando actually spoke with folks at KMH, spoke with healthcare practitioners, with patients, interacted with fans, so we could bring these important topics to life. It wasn't just like I'm doing a TikTok and bouncing, which a lot of times happens, like I'm doing a performance, but really creating that relevancy and that authenticity for this community. So it created it wasn't just a cool experience. I went to a Johnny Orlando concert. It was, I got to meet this person who I'm a fan of their music, and we got to talk about something that was real, that was affecting me in my life.
Nithya, first of all, I have one last question.
Of course.
I'd love to hear, your maybe a lesson you learned from business mentor. It could be Mark Harrison, it could be someone else, or both. Before you answer that, I want to encourage people to check out the t1agency.com to learn more about what they're working on, and you can check out more episodes of the podcast as well. So Nithya, talk about maybe a mentor or two and maybe a lesson.
Yeah, I think one a previous manager that I had, her name is Becca Young, also still a great friend. I learned a lot of stuff from her, from the strategy mindset. She's the one that really trained me in on strategy. But she taught me about a couple of things that I still hold really, really close. One was around boundaries, to be really frank. And I would say that she taught me around boundaries from a strategy perspective, right? She was like, in order to do really good strategy, you need thinking time. And sometimes that thinking time is you're going to spend 2 hours staring out the window and 15 minutes writing that deck, because you just need that time to think. And I think, she was talking very specifically in coaching on like how to write a strategy deck. But I think that's also just a really great lesson for us to think about in the way that we lead our lives now, especially as things have become quick, virtual, everything is back to back Zoom calls or Teams calls all the time. It's how do you set those boundaries to actually think, to do really good work, that time that you need for yourself, because we can't keep managing based on a calendar. We need to manage our time based on capacity, right? So I think that was one really big lesson that she taught me that I've maintained to date. The other thing that she really taught me was like standing up for what you believe in. And sometimes that gets you in trouble. Like when she was my previous manager, she stood up for me in a leadership team meeting when somebody said something incorrectly about me. She stood up to her entire senior leadership team, including her boss and boss's bosses, because she knew that was inherently the right thing to do. So she taught me a lot about courage. She taught me a lot about standing up for what's right, acknowledging that it still might get you in trouble, especially in a corporate setting, but that the importance of staying true to what's right and to yourself is paramount. What's going to help you go to sleep at the end of the day as well. So something she gave me a lot of sense of agency to actually speak up that part of my mind and my being, of speaking up for what's right and standing by it.
Love it. Nithya, I'm only the first one to thank you. Thanks for sharing your journey, your lessons. Everyone can check out the t1agency.com to learn more, and we'll see everyone next time. Nithya, thanks so much.
Thanks, Jeremy. Appreciate it.
What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I'm feeling like 100 grand.